In 1907, a team of hydrologists and surveyors traveled to the northeast shore of Loch Ness to study the lake bed, intending to pave the way for a new lock on the Caledonian Canal. They carried measuring chains, maps in oiled covers, and the confidence of men of science who believed that the depths of the lake contained nothing but silt, stones, and cold water. But when the ropes began to break at an impossible depth, when the metal links were crumpled like paper by an unknown force, and when those pale yellow eyes, cold as the abyss itself, appeared in the fog, it became clear that something lived beneath the ink-black surface of the lake that did not want to be disturbed. What rose from the depths on those July nights left behind only scraps of rope, a torn coat, and a fear that no amount of water could wash away, even 20 years later. So before we continue, please make sure you're subscribed and let us know where you're watching from. Thank you. I was 28 years old when I first saw Loch Ness in a way that forever changed my understanding of the world. I arrived there not as a tourist or a romantic, enchanted by the legends of the Highlands, but as a hydraulic engineer, a member of a government expedition led by William Fraser, chief engineer of the Caledonian Canal Extension Project. William was a man of about 45, with graying temples and a manner of speaking as if every word were carved in stone, precise, firm, without unnecessary embellishment. He had supervised the construction of 3 bridges in Inverness and earned a reputation as a man who never backed down from a challenge. Working alongside him was James Graham, a senior surveyor with 30 years of experience, whose hands, covered with old scars from dozens of expeditions, moved with clockwork precision as he unfolded maps or adjusted the theodolite. James was quiet, speaking only when necessary, and his eyes showed the weariness of a man who had seen too many swamps, mountains, and rivers. Thomas Campbell, our engineer with medical training, had received his education in Edinburgh and always carried a small leather bag with tools and bandages, although he joked that in his entire career he had mainly treated paper cuts and strains from carrying equipment. Hugh Mackenzie, a sturdy man in his 30s with a red beard and a loud laugh, was responsible for all the mechanical equipment: winches, cables, anchors. Patrick Stewart was our cartographer, a man so methodical as to be pedantic, who could spend an hour drawing a single line of the coastline until he achieved a perfect likeness to reality. I especially remember Angus Robertson, our guide and translator, a local who grew up on the shore of the lake and knew every rock, every shoal, every dangerous current. Angus was short, wiry, with a face weathered by years of working on the water, and he spoke Gaelic as fluently as English, switching between languages depending on who he was talking to. He knew the lake not from maps, but from memory. The memory of a fisherman whose life depended on understanding the moods of the water. And then there was Alistair MacDonald, a 16-year-old cartographer's apprentice, the son of a local farmer, a boy with a sharp mind and burning eyes who dreamed of one day mapping distant lands himself. He carried Patrick's heavy tool case and absorbed every word his older colleagues said like a sponge. We settled into a small house on the outskirts of the village of Drumnadrochit, a 2-story stone building with low ceilings and small windows overlooking the lake. The July summer was warm. The evenings were mild and long, and the sun set late, painting the water in shades of gold and pink. But at night, when the temperature dropped, a thick fog rose over the lake, turning the world into a milky white void where there were no shores, no horizon, no distances. By morning, usually around 8 or 9 o'clock, the fog would dissipate and the lake would become visible again. Dark, calm, impenetrable. Our work began early. At 6 in the morning, we loaded the equipment into 2 large boats, checked the cables and measuring chains, and packed the instruments into waterproof cases. We had breakfast of oatmeal with milk, bread, and salted fish, which Angus bought from local fishermen. We had lunch right on the water, cold meat, cheese, apples. In the evening, when we returned to shore, we had hot soup or stewed meat for dinner, prepared by the owner of the house, an elderly woman named Mrs. McIntosh, who treated us with respect but wariness, as if we were engaged in something we would have been better off not starting. The first 3 days passed calmly and methodically. We went out onto the lake, lowered measuring chains to different depths, recorded the readings, and mapped the bottom. The lake was deeper than the old data showed. In places, the bottom went down to 200 meters or more, forming underwater depressions and gorges. The water was cold even in July, dark, almost black. And when you looked into it, it seemed like you were looking into a bottomless abyss. But on the fourth day, something strange happened. We were working half a kilometer from the shore in a place where, according to our measurements, the depth was about 30 meters. The weather was windless. The lake was completely smooth, not a single ripple. The surface resembled a dark mirror. Hugh lowered the measuring chain and we waited for the load to reach the bottom. Suddenly, even though there was no breeze or the slightest movement of air, circular waves appeared on the surface of the lake, spreading out from a point about 100 meters from our boat. The circles followed one after another, smooth and slow, as if something huge was moving under the water, rising to the surface. Angus, sitting at the stern, sat up straight and stared at the water, his face turning pale. "What is that?" William asked, looking at the spreading circles. "I don't know," Angus replied quietly, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Something between fear and awe. The circles continued for about a minute, then stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The water became smooth again. We looked at each other, but no one said a word. Hugh began to raise the chain, and when the load appeared on the surface, we saw that the cable was intact. But James frowned as he examined the metal links. "Look," he said, pointing to one of the links. "It's deformed." We leaned closer. The link was indeed slightly bent, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. But it could have been an accident. Perhaps the chain had hit a rock on the bottom. We continued our work, moving further along the shore. By evening, we had taken a few more measurements, and everything was going well until we decided to check the depth in an area that Angus called by a strange Gaelic name, which translated as Devil's Mouth. It was a depression about 200 meters from the shore where the bottom dropped sharply. We approached this spot in the late afternoon, when the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the water in dark red tones. Hugh lowered the chain, and it went down and down until it reached 230 meters. Then, completely unexpectedly, the cable jerked sharply, stretched to its limit, and there was a metallic clang. Hugh didn't even have time to cry out. The chain broke, the end of the cable whizzed upward, nearly hitting him in the face, and disappeared into the water. We stared at the piece of rope that remained in Hugh's hands. The metal links were not just broken. They were crushed and deformed, as if a steamroller had run over them. "That's impossible," Thomas muttered, picking up the rope and examining it. "This chain can withstand a load of 3 tons. What could have crushed it like this?" No one answered. Angus stared at the water, his jaw clenched, and I noticed that his hands, which were holding the oar, were shaking. William ordered us to row to shore. We returned in silence, unloaded the equipment, and went up to the house. We spoke little at dinner, and when Mrs. McIntosh, noticing our gloomy faces, asked if everything was all right, William replied briefly that we had lost the equipment because the rope had broken. She nodded without asking any more questions, but her gaze lingered on us a little longer than usual, as if she knew more than she was saying. The next morning, as we were preparing to go out on the lake, an old woman in a dark headscarf and long skirt approached the pier. It was Moira MacDonald, the mother of one of the local fishermen. Her face was lined with wrinkles, but her eyes, despite her age, remained sharp and attentive. She spoke to us in Gaelic, and Angus translated her words, although it was clear from the expression on his face that he was uncomfortable doing so. "She says you shouldn't lower your chains deep after dark," Angus said slowly. "The old beast senses the vibrations, and when she rises from the depths, the water turns black as tar. Her grandfather saw it drag a boat with 3 men in it in 1851. Only the wreckage was found the next day, and it was all marked with strange scratches, as if someone had run steel claws across the wood." William politely thanked the old woman, but when she left, he smiled and shook his head. "Superstition," he said. "The locals always tell stories like that. Every lake, every forest has its own monster." James said nothing, but I noticed that he didn't smile. We loaded a new, stronger measuring chain and went out onto the lake again. The day was clear, the fog had lifted early, and we worked until noon without incident. But then, as we approached the shore to take another measurement in shallow water, Alistair, standing at the bow of the boat, suddenly froze and pointed to the shore. "Look," he said. "What's that?" We moored and went ashore. What Alistair had seen made us fall silent. In the muddy ground, about 5 paces from the water, there were 3 parallel furrows, deep and even, running from the lake to the shore rocks and back. Each furrow was about 2 finger joints deep, and the distance between them was slightly more than the length of my arm from elbow to fingertips. I knelt down next to the tracks and placed my palm on one of the furrows. My hand didn't cover it. The groove was wider, and as I tried to imagine what kind of claw or paw could have left such a mark, my throat went dry. James crouched down next to me, took a folding knife out of his pocket, and stuck it into the bottom of the groove to measure its depth. The knife went in all the way to the handle. "It's fresh," he said quietly. "The earth is still damp. The edges haven't crumbled. It was made recently, maybe tonight." Before we continue, write in the comments, have you ever seen tracks that you couldn't explain? Your opinion is important to us. Angus stood up and took a few steps back, his gaze sweeping the shoreline as if he were looking for something else. Patrick took out his notebook and began sketching the tracks, his pencil moving quickly, recording the shape, distance, and direction. Hugh walked around the tracks in a circle, bent down, and picked up a small stone from the ground that had the same scratches on it. 3 parallel lines, deep and even. "What could have done this?" asked Alistair, his voice trembling. "A bear? A deer? Bear claws don't leave marks like this," James replied without looking up from the grooves. "And the distance between them is too great. Deer have hooves, not claws. Maybe someone did it on purpose," Thomas suggested. "To scare us. Local residents who don't want us working here." William silently examined the tracks, his face impassive. Then he straightened up and looked at the lake, its surface calm, reflecting the clouds and distant mountains. "Let's continue our work," he said firmly, "but let's be more careful. And no one works alone." We returned to the boats and continued along the shore. Half an hour later, we came across the wreckage of a boat, washed up on a narrow strip of sandy shore between the rocks. The wood was darkened by water, partially rotten, and there were deep parallel scratches on the sides, the distance between which exactly matched the furrows we had seen earlier. Angus recognized the boat. It was the Saint Columba, belonging to a fisherman named Duncan MacDonald, who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier along with his boat. He was never found, and the search was called off after a week, assuming he had drowned and the boat had been carried away by the current. But now, looking at these scratches, at the splintered boards, I realized that the current couldn't have done this. Hugh ran his fingers over the scratches, his face turning pale. "These aren't from rocks," he said. "Rocks don't leave such smooth lines." Near the wreckage of the boat on the rocks along the shore, Alistair found something even stranger. They were large fragments resembling thick, calloused skin, the size of an adult man's palm, dark gray in color. They were cold and slippery to the touch, even though they had been lying in the sun for several hours. Thomas picked up one fragment and examined it closely, sniffed it, and grimaced. "Strange," he muttered. "It smells like rotten fish and seaweed, but there's something else, like iodine or sea salt. But the lake is fresh water," Patrick pointed out. "I know," Thomas nodded. "That's what bothers me." The smell was truly disgusting, heavy, penetrating, stomach-churning. I felt slightly nauseous and took a step back. James took the fragment from Thomas's hands, turned it over, tried to bend it. The material was dense, elastic, resistant to finger pressure. "It's not fish scales," he said slowly. "And it's not the skin of any animal I know. It's too thick, too strong." We gathered several fragments and put them in a waterproof bag to study later. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. We continued our work, taking measurements and recording data, but our minds were preoccupied with what we had found on the shore. In the evening, we returned to the house, had dinner, and William gathered us in the large room on the first floor. He laid out Patrick's sketches, the pieces of skin and the scrap of rope on the table. "We need to discuss what's going on," he said. "We found traces of unknown origin, fragments of a boat with scratches, strange pieces of leather. The measuring chain was broken and crumpled. All this requires an explanation. Maybe there are large fish living in the lake," Thomas suggested. "Sturgeon or something like that. They can grow to enormous sizes." "Sturgeons don't come ashore," James objected, "and they don't leave traces like this." "Then it's a crocodile," said Hugh, "although there are no crocodiles in Scotland." "Exactly," Angus interrupted him. "There are no crocodiles in Scotland, but there is something else in the lake. What old Moira was talking about, a beast from the depths." Silence fell. William frowned, but did not ridicule Angus's words. Instead, he said, "We are scientists and engineers. Our job is to find a rational explanation. Tomorrow we will continue our investigation, but we will work in groups. No one will be alone. And we will set up surveillance at night to find out what is leaving these tracks. We went to our rooms, but sleep did not come. I lay in the dark, listening to the wind rustling in the window, thinking about those furrows in the ground, the scratches on the boat wreckage, the cold pieces of skin. And the more I thought about it, the stronger the feeling became that we had invaded a place that did not want us there, and that something living in the depths of the lake was watching us, waiting for the right moment. The next day, we decided to explore the part of the lake that Angus called Devil's Mouth, a deep depression where our measuring chain had broken the day before. William insisted that we needed to obtain accurate data on the depth and structure of the bottom in this area, as it was here that the possible construction of an additional lock was planned. We set out on the lake around 8 in the morning. The fog had not yet completely dissipated, but it was already beginning to thin, turning into a translucent haze through which the outlines of the opposite shore could be seen. The boats moved slowly, the oars plunging silently into the water, and the only sound was the splash and creak of the oarlocks. When we reached the spot where the cable had broken yesterday, Hugh lowered a new, stronger measuring chain, and we began to move slowly in a circle, measuring the depth every 10 meters. The bottom dropped away rapidly. First 30 meters, then 50, then the chain continued to unwind until it reached 270 meters. The water in this spot was ink black, and even the sun's rays, which began to break through the fog, did not make it any lighter, as if it absorbed the light without reflecting it back. "There's an almost vertical underwater wall here," James said, making notes in his logbook. "The bottom drops off at an angle of about 70 degrees. That explains why it's so deep here." Angus sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the dark water below, his face expressing something akin to reverential awe. "Fishermen never set their nets closer than 500 meters from this spot," he said quietly. "My father said that once they tried it, and the next morning the nets were torn and the fish in them were dead and mangled, as if they had been put through a meat grinder. We finished our measurements and began rowing toward the shore, but we hadn't gone more than 50 meters when Patrick, sitting at the stern, suddenly pointed to the water behind us. "Look," he said, his voice sounding alarmed. We turned around. On the surface of the water, where we had just been taking measurements, a strange ripple appeared, even though there was no wind or current. The circles spread out from the center, slow and steady, as if something huge was moving in the depths, rising to the surface. We froze, our eyes fixed on the water. The ripples continued for a few seconds, then stopped, and the surface became smooth again. But now, where the circles had been, the water seemed darker, almost black, as if a shadow had fallen on it from below. "Row," William ordered, and his voice lacked its former confidence. We leaned on our oars and quickly headed for the shore. No one looked back. Only when the boats touched the bottom in shallow water and we stepped onto solid ground did I feel myself breathing again. We spent the rest of the day on the shore, drawing maps and discussing the data we had collected. But no one suggested returning to the water. In the evening, we decided to explore the coastal strip along the eastern shore of the lake, where, according to Angus, strange things were sometimes found washed up by the water. We walked along the shoreline, clambering over rocks and boulders slippery with seaweed, until we reached a place where the shore narrowed to a strip of sand between two rocky outcrops. It was here that Hugh stopped and crouched down, examining something on the sand. We came closer and saw the same grooves. 3 parallel lines, deep and smooth, running from the water inland. But this time the grooves were longer, stretching for almost 20 paces, and next to them in the sand were other tracks, wide, flat prints, like the prints of huge flippers. Each print was slightly longer than my foot, elongated with 5 distinct lines fanning out like webbed fingers. Between the prints was a wide strip where the sand had been flattened, as if something massive and heavy had been dragged across it. "My God," Thomas gasped. "These are the tracks of something that came ashore." Alistair backed away, his face pale, and instinctively grabbed Patrick's arm as if seeking protection. James knelt down and placed his hand on one of the flipper prints. His hand didn't even cover half of it. "It was a large creature," he said slowly. "Very large. And judging by the freshness of the sand, it was here recently. Perhaps last night." I felt a chill run down my spine. We were standing in this narrow spot between the rocks, and the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the water in dark red tones. And suddenly it seemed to me that the walls of the rocks had moved closer, that the space had shrunk, that we were trapped. Hugh straightened up, his face tense, and looked at the lake, at its dark, motionless surface. "We need to get out of here," he said. Right now. William didn't argue. We quickly left the place and returned to the house as it was getting dark. We didn't talk much at dinner, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But when Mrs. McIntosh took the dishes away and we were left alone, James broke the silence. "I've been a surveyor for 30 years, he said slowly. "I've been to Africa, India, South America. I've seen the tracks of lions, elephants, crocodiles, anacondas. But what we saw today, it's unlike anything I know." "Then what is it?" Thomas asked. James shook his head. "I don't know. But I do know one thing. These tracks were left by a creature that lives in water but can come ashore. It's a large, powerful creature with claws and flippers. And it was here recently. Maybe it's a seal," Patrick suggested, "or a sea lion. They can swim into freshwater bodies of water. Seals don't leave tracks like this," Angus objected. "And they don't break steel chains." Silence fell. Then William said, "Tomorrow we'll set up surveillance. We'll set up camp on the shore, near where we saw the tracks. If something comes out of the water at night, we'll see it." "What if it sees us?" Alistair asked quietly. "We have guns," William replied. "We'll be ready." But his words brought me no comfort. I went up to my room, lay down on the bed, but sleep would not come. Outside the window was darkness, and somewhere out there, in that darkness, the lake lay still and cold, keeping something in its depths that did not want to be disturbed. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that invisible eyes were following our every move, assessing us, waiting. The next day, we went ashore early, taking with us tents, food supplies, kerosene lamps, and guns. William, James, and Hugh were armed with cap guns. I took my shotgun, and Patrick and Thomas took revolvers. Alistair was not given a weapon. He was too young. We set up camp where we had seen the tracks the day before, on a small hill with a good view of the lake and the shore. The day was clear, the sun was shining, and it was hard to believe that anything terrible could happen here. We set up 2 tents, built a fire, and prepared lunch. Stewed meat with vegetables. After lunch, William assigned watch shifts, 2 people per shift, each shift lasting 3 hours. James and Hugh were the first to take their turn. Then Thomas and Patrick were to replace them, and William and I took the last shift before dawn. Angus stayed with us, refusing to return to the village, even though William suggested he do so. Alistair dozed by the fire, wrapped in a blanket. Evening came unnoticed. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and purple. And a thick, dense fog began to rise over the lake, turning the world into a milky white void. Visibility was reduced to 12 meters, and soon we could no longer even make out the shoreline. James and Hugh sat at the edge of the camp, their silhouettes barely visible in the fog, and from time to time we heard their quiet voices discussing something. The rest sat by the fire, silently staring into the flames. I checked my shotgun, made sure the cartridges were in place, and put the weapon next to me. The fire burned steadily, the tongues of flame casting flickering shadows on the walls of the tents and on people's faces. And in those shadows, I imagined something sinister, as if something was lurking outside the circle of light, waiting for its moment. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, James and Hugh returned to the fire, their faces tense. "You can't see anything in this fog," James said. "The visibility is poor too. Sounds are distorted. It seems like they're coming from everywhere at once." Thomas and Patrick took their revolvers and went to the observation post. We sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the night, the rustle of the wind, the lapping of the water, the crackling of the fire. Alistair woke up, looked at us with frightened eyes, and closed them again, pretending to be asleep. Time dragged on slowly. Each minute seemed like an hour, and I began to doze off, my head nodding toward my chest, when suddenly Angus sat up straight, his hand shooting up, demanding silence. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. We froze, straining our ears. At first, I heard nothing but the usual night sounds, but then I felt it. A low vibration that was felt not by my ears, but by my whole body, as if someone had run a bow across a giant string somewhere deep underground. The vibration grew, turning into a deep, hollow sound, like a long moan coming from the very depths of the lake. The sound lasted about 10 seconds, making our teeth vibrate and causing a primitive animal fear that cannot be controlled by reason. Then it faded away abruptly and silence reigned, heavy and oppressive, as if the whole world had held its breath. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my palms becoming clammy with sweat, my throat drying up. James got up, grabbed his rifle, and I followed suit. Hugh threw more wood on the fire, the flames leaping up, casting light several meters around, but the fog absorbed it, preventing it from penetrating further. "What was that?" Alistair whispered, his voice trembling. No one answered. We stood there, gripping our weapons, and waited. A minute passed, then another, and suddenly the sound repeated itself, now closer, louder, and I felt the vibration pass through the ground, rise up my legs, and shake my chest. It wasn't just a sound. It was a call, a signal, something that carried meaning I couldn't understand but felt on an instinctual level. The call stopped, and silence fell again. Then, from the fog, from the direction of the lake, came the voices of Thomas and Patrick. They were shouting something, their words lost in the fog, but I could make out one word repeated twice. "There." We rushed to the observation post. I ran, holding my shotgun at the ready, the fog enveloping me, cold and damp, making it difficult to breathe. A few seconds later, I saw the silhouettes of Thomas and Patrick standing motionless, their hands with revolvers lowered as if they had forgotten they were holding weapons. I ran up to them and stopped, following the direction of their gaze. What I saw made me freeze, and for a moment, time stood still. Out of the fog, about 30 paces from the shore, rose a long, snake-like neck, dark gray, smooth, as thick as a strong man's arm at the base and tapering toward the head. The neck rose above the water to a height greater than 2 men standing on each other's shoulders, and at its top was a small, elongated head with massive jaws. 2 pale yellow glowing spots on either side of the head were fixed on us, motionless, cold, devoid of any expression I could recognize. Behind the head, in the mist, 3 dark humps, each the size of a large barrel, could be seen slowly rising and falling above the surface of the water in time with its breathing. The creature stood completely still, making no sound, and this stillness was more frightening than any roar or screech, because it spoke of control, of intent, of the fact that the creature was not acting instinctively, but was observing, studying, making decisions. It did not panic or rush at us with the fury of a hungry predator. It did not make threatening sounds or show aggression. It just stood there in the fog and watched. It looked the way a person looks at an insect that has crawled into their house, with cold curiosity, assessing whether to swat it now or wait. It wasn't afraid of us. It didn't perceive us as a threat. We were something insignificant, unworthy of an immediate reaction. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe a minute, maybe less. But it seemed like an eternity to me. None of us raised our weapons, fired a shot, or shouted. We stood there, paralyzed not by fear, but by the realization that we were facing something that should not exist, something beyond our understanding of the world. Then, as slowly and silently as it had appeared, the neck began to sink, submerging into the water without a single splash, without a ripple, as if it were being pulled down by an invisible force. The head disappeared, then the humps, one after another, and finally, when the last hump disappeared below the surface, the water began to move, forming a funnel several meters in diameter, pulling in floating debris, branches, algae, wisps of fog. The funnel spun for a few seconds, then disappeared, and the surface of the lake became smooth again, as if nothing had happened. I felt my legs buckle and sank to my knees, the shotgun slipping from my hands and falling to the ground. My breathing was ragged. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest, and my hands were shaking so much I couldn't control them. Nearby, Thomas made a strange sound, something between a laugh and a sob, and leaned his back against a rock, slowly sliding down. Patrick stood motionless, his face white as chalk, his lips moving as if he were trying to say something, but no sound came out. A moment later, the others ran up to us, William, James, Hugh, Angus, and Alistair. They had seen the creature too, at least partially, through the fog, and their faces showed the same shock, the same disbelief. "Did we all see that?" Hugh asked hoarsely. "Or am I going crazy?" "We all saw it," James replied quietly. William walked to the edge of the shore and looked at the water, at the spot where the creature had just been. His face was impassive, but I noticed his hands trembling as they gripped the rifle barrel. "Let's go back to camp," he said. "Right now." We returned to the fire, but no one sat down. Everyone stood huddled together, as if being close to each other could protect us from what we had seen. Alistair cried silently, tears streaming down his cheeks, and Patrick hugged the boy's shoulders, his own body shaking. Hugh threw some wood on the fire and the flames burned brighter, but the heat didn't reach me. The cold came from within, from my very bones. James took out a flask of whiskey, took a big swig, and passed it to Thomas, who drank without wiping the neck and passed it on. I drank too, the alcohol burning my throat but slightly numbing the trembling in my hands. "What was that?" Thomas asked, his voice sounding strange, detached. "What the hell was that?" "What old Moira was talking about," Angus replied. "And Niseg, the beast from the depths." "That's impossible," said William, but his voice lacked its former confidence. "Such creatures don't exist." "We just saw it," James objected. "All of us." It was real. Silence fell. The fire crackled. The fog thickened around us, and somewhere far away on the lake, that low, vibrating sound came again, now very close, as if the creature was circling our camp, not retreating into the depths. I grabbed my shotgun and jumped to my feet, but William put his hand on my shoulder. "Don't shoot," he said. "If it wanted to attack, it would have done so already." "Then what does it want?" asked Hugh. No one answered because there was no answer. We sat by the fire all night, not sleeping, listening to every sound, and only when dawn began to break, when the fog began to dissipate, turning into a light haze, did we feel the tension ease. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, and the lake became a normal lake again. Calm, dark, silent. But I knew that this was only an illusion, that beneath the surface, 200 meters down in the inky darkness, the creature was waiting, watching, and sooner or later it would rise again. For the next 2 days, we did not go out on the lake. William insisted on continuing the work, but even he understood that after what we had seen, no one on the team would voluntarily get into a boat. We stayed in the house, compiling maps from the data we already had and discussing further actions. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts, and conversation was rare. Alistair hardly left his room, and when I went in to see him, I found the boy lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, his face pale and gaunt. Thomas tried to act normal, but I noticed his hands shaking as he poured tea and how he flinched at any loud noise. Patrick endlessly redrew the same coastline in his notebook, his movements mechanical and meaningless. James sat by the window looking out at the lake, his eyes empty. On the third day, October 28th, William gathered us together and said that we had to complete at least a minimum amount of work. Otherwise, the project would be shut down and all our efforts would be in vain. He suggested going out on the lake during the day, in clear weather, and taking a few more control measurements in shallow water away from the deep basin. Hugh supported him, saying that the creature only appeared at night in the fog and that we would be safe during the day. I wasn't sure about that, but I kept quiet because I understood that William was right. We couldn't just drop everything and leave without completing the task. We arrived at the lake around noon. The weather was clear, the sun was shining brightly, the water seemed almost blue, reflecting the sky, and it was hard to believe that something terrible could be hiding here. We worked quickly, lowering chains into the shallow water, taking measurements, and recording data. By evening, we had finished and were about to return when Hugh suggested securing a metal anchor for the measuring platform, which we planned to use the next day. The anchor was heavy, weighing about 50 kilograms, and Hugh tied it to a sturdy rope, intending to lower it to a depth of about 50 meters, where the bottom was relatively flat. William agreed, and Hugh began to lower the anchor overboard, holding the rope with both hands. The anchor descended slowly, the rope unraveling with a characteristic rustle, and we watched how far it went. 30 meters, 40, 50. Hugh was about to stop when suddenly the rope tightened sharply, as if the anchor had caught on something on the bottom, and in the next moment, Hugh flew overboard with a cry. It all happened so fast that we didn't even have time to reach out. Hugh fell into the water with a loud splash, and his scream was cut short as soon as his head went under. I rushed to the side, as did the others, and we saw something large and dark flash beneath the surface, swift and powerful, and the water around where Hugh had fallen began to bubble, turning reddish with foam. James grabbed a boat hook and tried to hook Hugh. Thomas dived overboard, but a second later he jumped back out, his face contorted with horror. "There's nothing there," he shouted. "He's gone! It took him!" We stood at the side of the boat, helpless, watching the water slowly calm down, the reddish foam dissolving, and in a minute, there was nothing left but a few bubbles rising to the surface. William ordered us to row to shore, his voice hoarse. We leaned on the oars and quickly reached shallow water, jumped out of the boats, and ran to shore without looking back. Only when we were on solid ground did I feel myself breathing again. We stood there, breathing heavily, looking at the lake, at its calm, serene surface, and couldn't believe that something terrible had happened here just a few minutes ago. "We have to look for him," Patrick said. "Maybe he's alive." "He's not alive," Thomas replied quietly. "I saw blood, a lot of blood." We returned to the house and reported what had happened. William sent Angus to the village to organize a search, and by evening, several boats with local fishermen had gone out onto the lake, combing the coastal waters. But they found nothing except a fragment of Hugh's coat, which floated up an hour after the tragedy. The fabric was torn, the edges ragged as if it had been put through a millstone, and there were dark stains on it that could have been blood. The search continued until dark, then they stopped, deciding to resume the next day. But I knew they wouldn't find Hugh. He was down there, in the inky darkness, and whatever had taken him wasn't going to give his body back. That night we gathered in the large room. No one spoke of sleep. Everyone knew that sleep would not come. William sat at the table, his face gray, staring at his hands as if he did not recognize them. James stood by the window, looking into the darkness beyond the glass, his lips moving silently as if he were praying or cursing. Thomas and Patrick sat next to each other, holding hands like children frightened by a thunderstorm. Alistair lay on the sofa, covered with a blanket, his body shaking with silent sobs. Angus smoked his pipe silently, staring into space. "It's not just an animal," James said suddenly, his voice loud in the silence. "It plans, it thinks, it knew we would drop anchor and waited for that moment. It hunted us." His words hung in the air, and no one objected because we all felt the same way. The creature didn't act on instinct. It didn't attack at random. It chose a moment when one of us was vulnerable, when we weren't expecting an attack, and it acted quickly, precisely, without hesitation. It was an intelligent creature, or at least one capable of planning, and that thought was scarier than anything else. "We have to leave," Thomas said. "Right now. Drop everything and leave before it kills someone else." "We can't just leave," William objected. "They'll accuse us of cowardice, of failing the project. We need to hell with the project." Thomas interrupted him, his voice rising to a shout. "Hugh is dead. They could have killed us all. Do you want to stay here and wait for that thing to come back?" William didn't answer. He lowered his head, and I saw his shoulders shaking. James moved away from the window and put his hand on his shoulder. "Thomas is right," he said quietly. "We have to leave. But not now, not at night. In the morning, at dawn. We'll pack our things, close up camp, and leave. But first, we have to get through this night." We agreed. William assigned shifts. 2 people at each window, 2 at the doors. We loaded our guns, checked our ammunition, lit all the kerosene lamps in the house, and waited. Time dragged slowly. Each minute seemed like an hour, and I listened to the sounds outside the window. The rustle of the wind, the lapping of the water, the distant cry of a night bird. Around midnight, we heard that low, vibrating sound coming from the lake, now closer than ever, as if the creature had come to the very shore. The sound lasted a few seconds, then stopped, and a heavy, oppressive silence fell. I gripped my shotgun and listened, but heard nothing more. The night passed without incident, and when dawn broke, we felt we could breathe again. At dawn, we gathered our things, loaded them into the carts, said goodbye to Mrs. McIntosh, and left the village. But William insisted that we stop at the ruins of a medieval tower on Cape Urquhart, which he had wanted to explore at the beginning of the expedition. The tower stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the deepest part of the lake, and William believed that it would be a good place to make some final observations before our departure. We didn't want to go there, but he was the leader, and we obeyed. The tower was a 13th century ruin, with 3 stone walls still standing, but the roof had long since collapsed, and bushes and moss grew inside. In the center of the tower was an ancient well, covered by a wooden shield, and when we lifted the shield, we saw that the well went down into darkness, and the sound of splashing water came from the bottom. Angus said that the well connected to the lake through underground cracks, and fishermen sometimes caught fish here by lowering their nets directly into the well. We examined the tower, made some notes, and were about to leave when we heard that sound again. A low, vibrating hum coming from the lake, but now it was very close, as if the creature was right below us, in the water at the base of the cliff. "Let's go," William ordered, his face pale. "Right now. We rushed toward the tower's exit, but before we could take more than a few steps, we heard a loud, powerful splash, followed by the grinding of stone against stone. We turned and saw a long, snake-like neck rising above the edge of the cliff, dark gray, smooth, wet with water. The neck rose higher and higher, and at its top was a head with pale yellow eyes fixed on us. The creature froze, and we froze too. And in that second, I saw it completely for the first time. Not through the fog, not partially, but in its entirety. The body was massive, about 15 meters long from head to tail, barrel-shaped in the middle, tapering toward the tail. Its skin was dark gray, covered in places with light spots and scars, old and whitish, as if the creature had lived for many years and survived many battles. Its neck was long and snake-like, about 4 meters long, as thick as the circumference of a barrel at the base, tapering toward the head. The head is small, elongated, about a meter long, with powerful jaws from which sharp conical teeth as long as my finger protrude, arranged in uneven rows. The eyes are 2 pale yellow glowing organs on the sides of the head, the size of a large plate, with no visible pupils, cold and impassive. 4 fins, 2 front and 2 rear, each about 2 meters long, similar to oars, with membranes between the fingers, 5 fingers on each fin, each ending in a long curved claw. 3 humps on the back, covered with thicker keratinized skin similar to armor. The tail was powerful, flattened on the sides, about 3 meters long, slowly moving from side to side, maintaining balance. Old scars were visible on the neck and sides. Deep, long, possibly from collisions with ships or other creatures. The creature looked at us, and its gaze was not that of an animal, but of something else, something capable of assessing and making decisions. It was in no hurry. It studied us, as if deciding whether we were worth the effort, whether we were worthy of its attention. Then it slowly began to climb the rocks, its front flippers clinging to the ledges, leaving deep grooves, its body dragging behind, leaving a wide trail on the ground. It moved slowly but purposefully, approaching the entrance to the tower. We raised our weapons, and William fired first. The crack of the shot echoed off the rocks and reverberated in the mountains, but the bullet did not seem to harm the creature. It did not even stop, continuing to climb. James fired, then I did. Then Thomas and Patrick emptied their revolvers, and the sounds of gunfire merged into a continuous roar. The creature froze, its neck jerked as if from a blow, and several dark spots appeared on its skin. But it did not retreat or turn back. It made that low, vibrating sound, now right in front of us, and the sound was so loud that I felt the walls of the tower shake and the stones beneath my feet tremble. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, the sky darkened. The wind, which had been absent all morning, rose with incredible force, chasing the clouds and turning them into dark, heavy clouds. The lake, which had been calm a second ago, went wild. The waves began to rise, first small, then higher and higher, until they reached a height of 2 human heights. The water crashed against the rocks with a deafening roar, the spray reaching the tower, and the wind howled like a living creature. The storm came so quickly, so suddenly, that it seemed impossible, but I saw it with my own eyes. The creature stopped, its head turned toward the lake, and it froze, as if listening. Then slowly, it began to retreat, climbing down the rocks back toward the water. Its movements were unhurried, without panic, as if it had decided to leave of its own accord and had not been forced to do so. It reached the water, and we saw its humps flash between the waves. Then it submerged, and the surface closed over it as if it had never been there. The storm lasted about an hour, and we took shelter inside the tower, huddling against the walls, listening to the howling wind and the roar of the waves. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm subsided, the wind died down, the clouds dispersed, and the lake became calm again. We looked outside and saw that the world had returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. William gave the order to move, and we rushed to the boats, which miraculously remained intact, tied to rocks on the opposite shore of the cape. We got into the boats and rowed away without looking back, battling the remaining waves. Only when we reached the opposite shore, far from that place, did I feel safe. We returned to the village, collected our belongings, and left for Inverness that same day. The next day, William gathered us in a hotel room and said what we all already knew. "No one will take what we saw seriously," he said. "They'll declare us crazy or drunk. The project will fail completely, our reputations will be destroyed. Hugh's family will only receive compensation if the cause was an accident. not an attack by a mythical monster. He took out a piece of paper and placed it on the table. This is a document about not sharing the details of the incident. The official story is that Hugh drowned when the cable broke. The project is closed because of bad geological conditions. If we all sign this, I guarantee that Hugh's family will get full compensation and none of us will suffer professionally. We looked at the paper, at these lines that turned the tragedy into a routine accident, that erased the existence of what we had seen. One by one, we signed the document. James was the last, his hand trembling as he wrote his name. 20 years have passed since those events, and I still see those pale yellow eyes in the fog. Still hear that low, vibrating sound that is felt in the chest before it is heard by the ear. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and can't tell if it's a dream or a memory. That rumbling, that fear, that certainty that somewhere in the darkness something huge and ancient is watching me. I've only told this story once to my son when he was about to enroll in surveying school. He looked at me with pity and said that I had been working too hard at the time, that fatigue and fog had played a cruel joke on me. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was all a hallucination caused by stress, tragedy, and isolation. But then how do you explain the furrows on the shore that we all saw? The torn rope crumpled like paper? The scars on the wreckage of the Saint? Columbus? The fragments of that gray skin that I still keep in my desk drawer, which have not dried out or decomposed over the years, but simply lie there, cold and dark, like the waters of Loch Ness? William Fraser reported that the project could not be completed due to unfavorable geological conditions and the tragic death of Hugh Mackenzie in an accident on the water. The project was closed and the lock was never built. James Graham retired a month after his return and never worked on the water again. He settled in a small town in central Scotland and died 10 years later in 1927 in his sleep. It is said that in his last years he did not leave the house after dark. Young Alistair stopped his studies and returned to work on his father's farm. He married and had children, but never allowed them to swim in lakes or rivers, and when asked why, he remained silent. Thomas Campbell continued to work as an engineer, but changed his specialization to urban construction, bridges, and roads. Nothing to do with water. Patrick Stewart left for America a year after the events, and I lost touch with him. Angus Robertson spread the word among local fishermen to avoid deep water after sunset, and many still follow this advice, although few know why. I, Donald McKinnon, continued my career as an engineer, but switched my specialization to railway construction and never worked on water again. I built bridges, laid tracks, and my work was successful. But every time a train crosses a river or lake, I look out the window and think about what might be lurking beneath the surface, in the dark depths where no light reaches. I know we saw something real that night on Loch Ness. I know that the creature that dragged Hugh away, that rose from the water, shattering our understanding of the world, was not a hallucination, not a figment of tired minds. And I know it's still there, in the depths, waiting, watching, and that someday someone else will lower their instruments too deep, disturb waters that should not be disturbed, and the beast will rise again from the abyss. And then, perhaps, there will be no storm to save them. Perhaps they will not be able to escape, and then the world will learn the truth that we buried 20 years ago when we signed that document of silence. But until then, the lake keeps its secret, dark, cold, ancient as the mountains themselves, and pale yellow eyes peer into the darkness, waiting.